They thought a fence would box them in, but one move turned their power into a prison of their own making. By the next morning, every neighbor was paying the price, literally. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching as Kevin Morrison, our tyrannical HOA president, supervised the installation of a 10-foot chain-link fence directly across the entrance to my family ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows through the metal links, creating a prison bar pattern across the driveway my grandfather had built 60 years ago. Kevin stood there in his pristine khaki shorts and polo shirt, clipboard in hand, that smug smile plastered across his face like he'd just won the lottery. What he didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. The fence stretched from property line to property line, blocking the only access road to my 500-acre cattle ranch, the same road my family had used for 3 generations. My hands clenched into fists as I watched the workers bolt the final section into place. Kevin caught sight of me through the window and had the audacity to wave, that condescending little finger wiggle he'd perfected over his 5 years as HOA dictator. He pointed at his clipboard, then at the fence, mouthing the words property improvement through the glass. Behind him stood his usual crew of enablers. Marcus Webb, the HOA treasurer who rubber-stamped every one of Kevin's ridiculous expenditures. Tom Bradley, the compliance officer who measured grass heights with a ruler. And Jake Patterson, Kevin's neighbor who'd been promised a pool permit in exchange for his unwavering loyalty. They all wore matching smirks, like bullies who'd just stuffed a kid in a locker. What they saw was a defeated rancher trapped behind their precious fence. What they didn't see was a man who'd spent 20 years in corporate law before returning home to run the family business. The fence wasn't just blocking my ranch. It was blocking the county road that ran through HOA territory to reach my property. A public road that had existed since 1952, long before these suburban warriors had built their cookie-cutter paradise. Kevin had finally crossed the line from petty harassment to illegal obstruction of public access. As I watched him shake hands with the fence installer, counting out cash from an envelope, I realized he'd just handed me the keys to his own destruction. I pulled out my phone and started recording, capturing Kevin's satisfied expression as he surveyed his handiwork. The timestamp showed 8:47 a.m. on what would become the worst day of Kevin Morrison's life. He had no idea that within 24 hours, his little power trip would cost him everything he'd built. The fence gleamed in the morning light like a monument to his arrogance, but all I could see was the rope he'd just tied around his own neck. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were above the law? Stick around, because Kevin Morrison was about to learn that some battles you should never pick. This is the story of how one fence became the beginning of the end for the most hated man in Willowbrook Estates, and how I turned his moment of triumph into his greatest nightmare. Kevin Morrison wasn't born evil. He was forged in the fires of middle management and a desperate need to control everything around him. At 42, he transformed from a mild-mannered insurance adjuster into the most feared man in Willowbrook Estates, wielding his HOA presidency like a medieval tyrant with a crown. His reign of terror had begun 5 years ago when he'd run unopposed for the position, mainly because everyone else was smart enough to avoid the thankless job. What they didn't realize was that Kevin saw it as his personal kingdom. Standing 5'6" in his custom-ordered HOA polo shirts, Kevin compensated for his unremarkable appearance with an oversized personality and an even bigger ego. He'd installed himself as the self-appointed guardian of property values, neighborhood aesthetics, and community moral standards. His daily routine included morning patrols in his pristine white Honda Civic, armed with a measuring tape, digital camera, and a growing stack of violation notices. He knew every blade of grass that grew too tall, every fence post that leaned slightly left, and every garbage can that dared to remain visible past collection day. The man had turned HOA enforcement into a full-time obsession. Marcus Webb, his loyal treasurer, often joked that Kevin treated the community guidelines like scripture, but there was nothing funny about the way he wielded those rules. Tom Bradley, the compliance officer, had become Kevin's personal enforcer, measuring setbacks and paint colors with scientific precision. Jake Patterson rounded out the inner circle as Kevin's eyes and ears, importing every minor infraction from his strategic corner lot position. Kevin's harassment campaign against me had started small. A citation for my truck being parked improperly in my own driveway, followed by complaints about my ranch-style mailbox being inconsistent with community standards. When I politely explained that my property predated the HOA by 30 years, Kevin had smiled that cold smile and informed me that grandfathered status doesn't exempt anyone from current community standards. The fines had escalated from there. $50 for excessive noise when my cattle load at dawn, $100 for commercial vehicle violations regarding my ranch truck, $200 for unapproved livestock on my own property. But Kevin's true genius lay in psychological warfare. He'd positioned himself as the protector of everyone else's investments, painting me as the neighborhood troublemaker whose very existence threatened their property values. He convinced Marcus that my ranch operations were incompatible with residential standards, persuaded Tom that my morning feeding schedules constituted noise pollution, and assured Jake that my success was somehow diminishing their own. He'd even started a whisper campaign suggesting that my cattle might carry diseases that could affect their precious landscaping. The man thrived on fear and submission. He destroyed other neighbors who dared to challenge him, forcing old Mrs. Henderson to repaint her house 3 times until the color met his approval, bankrupting young David Chun with endless violation fees until he'd been forced to sell and move away. Kevin collected these victories like trophies, each broken neighbor reinforcing his belief that he was untouchable. He'd built his power base through intimidation, selective enforcement, and the simple fact that most people would rather pay a fine than fight City Hall. What Kevin failed to understand was that every kingdom eventually faces a revolution, and every tyrant eventually meets someone who refuses to kneel. As I watch him admiring his illegal fence, I realized he'd finally encountered the one neighbor who wouldn't be bullied, bribed, or broken. Kevin Morrison was about to learn that some people fight back, and when they do, they fight to win. The fence was Kevin's masterpiece of calculated cruelty, but it was also his declaration of war against the wrong enemy. For months, he'd been escalating his attacks on my ranch operations, but blocking a county road crossed the line from HOA harassment into criminal territory. As I stood there documenting his handiwork, I realized Kevin had just committed the perfect crime, if you ignore the part where it was completely illegal and thoroughly documented by security cameras. The morning after the fence installation, Kevin arrived at my front door with his usual entourage. Marcus clutched a folder of official-looking documents. Tom carried his enforcement kit complete with measuring tools, and Jake held a professional camera for documentation purposes. Kevin wore his most official HOA polo shirt and carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed he'd just checkmate his opponent. His smile was pure predatory satisfaction as he handed me a cease and desist order for unauthorized ranch operations in a residential zone. "Morning, neighbor," Kevin announced with theatrical politeness. "I trust you've noticed our community improvement project. The fence represents our commitment to maintaining property values and ensuring compliance with residential standards." He gestured toward the barrier like a game show host revealing a prize. "Your commercial agricultural operations are no longer compatible with our community's vision, so we've taken steps to protect everyone's investments." I accepted his paperwork with the same calm demeanor that had served me well in 20 years of corporate litigation. "Interesting approach, Kevin. Tell me, did you get county approval for blocking a public road?" The question wiped the smile off his face for exactly 3 seconds before his arrogance reasserted itself. He exchanged glances with Marcus, who shuffled through his papers like he was looking for an answer that didn't exist. "That's a private road through HOA property," Kevin declared with the confidence of a man who'd never bothered to check property records. "The community association has every right to control access through our territory. Your grandfather's handshake agreements don't override modern property law." Tom nodded eagerly, snapping photos of my expression like he was documenting a surrender. Jake positioned himself strategically to capture Kevin's moment of triumph. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the previous night in the county records office, pulling every deed, survey, and right-of-way document related to our properties. The road Kevin had blocked wasn't just a private driveway. It was County Road 47, established in 1952 and never officially abandoned. The HOA had been granted an easement for their development, but that easement specifically preserved public access to all existing properties. Kevin's fence wasn't just blocking my ranch. It was obstructing a public thoroughfare. But Kevin's arrogance wouldn't let him stop there. Furthermore, he continued, pulling out a thick stack of violation notices. Your property is now subject to daily fines for noncompliance with community standards. $50 per day for livestock noise, $100 per day for commercial vehicle parking, $200 per day for unapproved agricultural activities. He handed me the citations with a flourish. Total current balance, $4,700, due within 30 days, or will be forced to pursue legal remedies. Marcus stepped forward with a foreclosure notice, his hands shaking slightly as he delivered what he clearly thought was the killing blow. The HOA board has voted unanimously to begin lien proceedings against your property. You have 15 days to bring your account current and remove all non-compliant elements, or will be forced to seek judicial sale of the premises. His voice cracked slightly on the word premises, but Kevin's encouraging nod kept him going. The beauty of Kevin's mistake wasn't just that he'd blocked a public road. It was that he'd done it so publicly, with so much documentation, while simultaneously attempting to extort money through fraudulent fines. He created a paper trail that would make any prosecutor's job embarrassingly easy. As I accepted their illegal notices and watched them document their illegal fence, I realized Kevin had just constructed his own legal gallows. Gentlemen, I said quietly, I'll need exactly 72 hours to respond to these interesting documents. I trust that's acceptable. Kevin's smile returned full force as he shook my hand, probably thinking he'd just accepted my surrender. What he'd actually done was give me 3 days to destroy his life, and I intended to make every hour count. As they walked away, I could hear Kevin already planning his victory celebration, completely unaware that he'd just handed me everything I needed to end his reign forever. While Kevin celebrated his supposed victory with evening cocktails on his pristine deck, I was 40 miles away in the state capitol, sitting across from District Attorney Michael Chun in his downtown office. Mike had been my law school roommate 25 years ago, and he'd built a reputation as the prosecutor who specialized in public corruption cases. When I called him that morning and mentioned HOA fraud, his interest had been immediate and intense. You're telling me this guy blocked a county road and is trying to foreclose on your property through fraudulent fines? Mike leaned back in his chair, reviewing the photographs and documents I'd spread across his conference table. And he documented everything himself. His expression shifted from professional interest to predatory satisfaction as he examined Kevin's carefully typed violation notices. This isn't just HOA overreach. This is organized crime masquerading as community service. The evidence was overwhelming, but Mike wanted to ensure our case was bulletproof. He'd assigned his best investigator, Detective Ray Sullivan, to work with me in building a comprehensive file. Ray was a 20-year veteran who specialized in financial crimes, and he'd seen enough HOA corruption to fill a small library. The beautiful thing about these neighborhood tyrants, Ray explained as we reviewed bank records, is that they always get sloppy with the money. Power corrupts, but financial greed makes them stupid. What we discovered exceeded even my expectations. Kevin hadn't just been harassing me. He'd been systematically looting the HOA treasury for years. Marcus Webb, the compliant treasurer, had been signing blank checks and falsifying financial reports under Kevin's direction. Tom Bradley had been collecting cash payments for selective enforcement, allowing Kevin's friends to violate community standards while hammering his enemies. Jake Patterson had been receiving kickbacks for reporting violations, turning Neighborhood Watch into a paid informant system. The road blockage was just the tip of Kevin's criminal iceberg. Detective Sullivan had uncovered forged maintenance contracts, inflated service bills, and missing funds totaling over $200,000 from the community's reserve accounts. Kevin had been using HOA money to pay for personal expenses, home improvements, and even his son's college tuition. The man who'd positioned himself as the guardian of everyone's property values had been stealing their money for half a decade. But the crown jewel of our investigation was Kevin's violation enforcement records. Ray had obtained copies of every citation issued over the past 5 years, and the pattern was staggering in its bias. Kevin's friends received warnings for violations that resulted in immediate fines for his enemies. Properties owned by elderly residents or single mothers were targeted for aggressive enforcement, while Kevin's inner circle operated with virtual immunity. The selective prosecution was so blatant that it constituted criminal harassment under state law. My legal background had taught me that the best revenge isn't emotional, it's systematic and thorough. While Kevin thought he was playing checkers with neighborhood politics, I was building a federal case that would involve multiple agencies. The road obstruction alone violated state transportation codes, but the financial fraud opened doors to FBI involvement. The selective enforcement constituted civil rights violations that could trigger Justice Department intervention. Detective Sullivan had also discovered Kevin's greatest vulnerability, his complete ignorance of actual property law. The fence blocking County Road 47 wasn't just illegal, it was spectacularly illegal. The county had never abandoned the right-of-way. The HOA had never been granted authority to control access, and Kevin's actions constituted criminal obstruction of a public thoroughfare. Better yet, he'd done it all while being recorded by 3 different security camera systems. As we finalized our evidence collection, Mike outlined the prosecution strategy that would ensure Kevin faced maximum consequences. We're looking at criminal conspiracy, theft by deception, abuse of office, obstruction of public access, and violation of civil rights under color of authority, he explained. Your neighbor didn't just pick the wrong fight. He committed enough felonies to keep him in prison until his grandchildren are adults. The final piece of our puzzle was the community impact assessment Ray had prepared. Kevin's tyrannical rule had driven away 12 families, cost residents over $300,000 in fraudulent fines, and decreased property values through his reign of terror. The man who'd claimed to protect everyone's investments had actually been destroying them while stealing their money. When the community learned the truth, Kevin wouldn't just face criminal charges. He'd face the collective wrath of every neighbor he'd victimized. The monthly HOA meeting on Thursday night was standing room only, which was unusual since Kevin typically held these gatherings in his living room with just his core supporters present. What Kevin didn't know was that I'd personally invited every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates, along with some very special guests who were waiting outside in unmarked vehicles. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents who'd been intimidated into silence for years finally gathered to witness Kevin's reckoning. Kevin entered the meeting room like a conquering hero, flanked by Marcus, Tom, and Jake, all wearing their matching HOA polo shirts like uniforms of a tiny army. He carried a thick folder of what he clearly believed were victory documents, photos of his illegal fence, copies of his fraudulent fines, and a prepared speech about protecting community standards. His smile was pure theatrical smugness as he surveyed the crowded room, probably thinking his fence had finally brought the troublemakers to heel. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin began, tapping his gavel with ceremonial authority. Tonight we celebrate a major victory for community standards and property values. The illegal ranch operations that have plagued our neighborhood have finally been brought under control through decisive HOA action. He gestured toward a poster-sized photograph of his fence, mounted on an easel like a trophy. This barrier represents our commitment to residential integrity and our authority to enforce community compliance. I let him continue for exactly 5 minutes, allowing Kevin to document his own crimes in front of 47 witnesses. He detailed how he'd taken decisive action against agricultural violations, explained his enhanced enforcement protocols for non-compliant properties, and outlined his comprehensive fine structure for ongoing violations. Every word was being recorded by 3 different devices, creating an unshakable record of his admissions. When Kevin finally paused for applause that never came, I stood up from my seat in the back row. Fascinating presentation, Kevin. Before we move to new business, I'd like to introduce some guests who've been very interested in your decisive actions." I walked to the front door and opened it, revealing Detective Ray Sullivan, two FBI agents, and County Attorney Sarah Martinez. The color drained from Kevin's face as badges appeared throughout the room. "Kevin Morrison," Detective Sullivan announced, "you're under arrest for criminal conspiracy, theft by deception, abuse of office, and obstruction of a public thoroughfare." The handcuffs clicked around Kevin's wrists as Ray continued reading his rights, each word echoing through the suddenly silent room. Marcus tried to slip toward the back exit, but FBI Agent Johnson was already waiting with a warrant for his arrest. Tom and Jake stood frozen like deer in headlights, watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. County Attorney Martinez addressed the shocked residents as Kevin and Marcus were led away. "The fence you see blocking access to the Johnson Ranch is illegally obstructing County Road 47, a public thoroughfare established in 1952. Mr. Morrison had no authority to block this road, and his actions constitute criminal obstruction." She held up the property records that clearly showed the road's public status. "Furthermore, our investigation has uncovered systematic financial fraud totaling over $200,000 stolen from your HOA accounts." The room erupted as residents realized the scope of Kevin's crimes. Mrs. Henderson stood up with tears in her eyes, holding violation notices that had cost her thousands in fraudulent fines. David Chin's elderly father waved foreclosure documents that Kevin had used to force his family from their home. One by one, Kevin's victims began sharing their stories, creating a chorus of testimony that would ensure his conviction. But the evening's biggest revelation came when FBI Agent Rodriguez presented the financial audit results. Kevin hadn't just been stealing HOA funds. He'd been using the money to pay for elaborate home renovations, luxury vacations, and his son's Ivy League education. The man who'd terrorized his neighbors over $50 grass violations had been living a lifestyle funded by their stolen dues and fraudulent fines. As the FBI finished loading evidence boxes into their vehicles, I addressed the stunned community. "Kevin Morrison's fence will be removed tomorrow morning by County Road crews. The fraudulent fines will be refunded from recovered assets, and the HOA will be restructured under court supervision to ensure this never happens again." The applause was thunderous. 5 years of suppressed anger and frustration finally finding release. The final image of the evening was Kevin being loaded into a police cruiser, still wearing his HOA polo shirt, while his illegal fence stood in the background like a monument to his arrogance. Tom and Jake had been released pending investigation, but their terrified expressions suggested they'd be cooperating fully with prosecutors. Marcus was facing charges as Kevin's co-conspirator, his treasurer duties having made him an active participant in the financial fraud. Kevin's moment of triumph had lasted exactly 6 days. His fence had become the evidence that destroyed him. His victory speech had become his confession, and his loyal supporters had become witnesses for the prosecution. The man who'd thought he was untouchable had just discovered that some people fight back with federal law enforcement agencies. 6 months later, Kevin Morrison stood in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his trademark HOA polo shirt, listening to Judge Patricia Williams sentence him to 8 years in federal prison. The courtroom was packed with Willowbrook Estates residents who'd driven 3 hours to witness the final chapter of Kevin's downfall. His wife, Sarah, sat in the front row, divorce papers already filed, and their house already in foreclosure proceedings to pay restitution to his victims. The charges had multiplied during the investigation like a cancer spreading through Kevin's entire life. The original road obstruction and HOA fraud had triggered a deeper federal probe that uncovered tax evasion, mail fraud, and racketeering charges. Kevin's systematic theft from the HOA had been classified as organized crime under the RICO Act, making him eligible for enhanced federal sentencing. His lawyer, an overpriced attorney named Robert Harrison, had tried everything from mental health defenses to claiming Kevin was the victim of a vindictive neighbor conspiracy. Detective Ray Sullivan's investigation had been thorough enough to impress FBI headquarters. Kevin's financial records revealed a 5-year crime spree that included forged contracts, kickbacks from service providers, and embezzlement of emergency reserve funds. The man who'd terrorized neighbors over Lawn Heights had been stealing money meant for community infrastructure repairs, leaving roads unpaved and drainage systems failing while he funded his lifestyle upgrades. Marcus Webb had flipped on Kevin within days of his arrest, providing prosecutors with detailed records of every fraudulent transaction and forged document. His cooperation had earned him a reduced sentence of 3 years probation, but his career in finance was permanently destroyed. Tom Bradley had received 18 months for his role in the enforcement conspiracy, while Jake Patterson got community service for his informant activities. All 3 men had been banned from ever serving in HOA leadership positions. The civil lawsuits had been even more devastating than the criminal charges. Every resident Kevin had victimized through fraudulent fines had joined a class action lawsuit that held him personally liable for their damages. Mrs. Henderson alone had been awarded $150,000 for the harassment that had forced her to sell her family home. David Chin's family received $200,000 for their wrongful foreclosure. The total civil judgment exceeded $2.8 million, ensuring Kevin would emerge from prison completely bankrupt. But the most satisfying destruction was happening to Kevin's reputation and social standing. Local news had covered his trial extensively, turning him into a cautionary tale about HOA corruption and neighborhood tyranny. His LinkedIn profile had been deleted, his insurance license revoked, and his professional references destroyed. The man who'd wielded power through fear and intimidation had become a laughingstock, his name synonymous with petty corruption and spectacular failure. County Road 47 had been permanently reopened within 24 hours of Kevin's arrest, with the illegal fence removed at his personal expense. The county had also filed liens against Kevin's property for the cost of road repairs and legal proceedings. His pristine white Honda Civic, once used for daily patrol harassment, had been seized as evidence and eventually sold at auction to pay restitution. Even his beloved measuring tape and citation clipboard had become exhibits in the federal case. The psychological impact on Kevin was perhaps the most complete revenge of all. 5 years of absolute power had been replaced by 8 years of absolute powerlessness. The man who'd controlled every aspect of his neighbors' lives was now subject to prison schedules, guard supervision, and cell block hierarchies. His carefully cultivated image as a community leader had been exposed as a facade covering criminal behavior and psychological instability. Judge Williams had been particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, noting that Kevin had violated the trust of his community, stolen from his neighbors, and used his position to satisfy personal grudges and financial greed. She'd specifically mentioned his obstruction of my ranch operations as evidence of his willingness to harm others for petty revenge. The 8-year sentence included restitution requirements that would follow Kevin for the rest of his life. As I sat in the courtroom watching Kevin led away in shackles, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. The fence he'd built to destroy me had become the foundation of his own destruction. His moment of triumph had been transformed into his complete downfall. The man who'd thought he was above the law had discovered that federal prosecutors have very different ideas about accountability. The final irony was that Kevin's illegal fence had lasted exactly 6 days, while his prison sentence would last 8 years. His attempt to block my access to success had instead blocked his own access to freedom. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone. It's what they do to themselves when you simply refuse to be their victim. 2 years after Kevin's sentencing, Willowbrook Estates had transformed from a neighborhood ruled by fear into a genuine community built on cooperation and mutual respect. The HOA had been restructured under court supervision, with new bylaws that prevented any single person from wielding the dictatorial power Kevin had abused. Monthly meetings were now held in the community center with full transparency, recorded minutes, and democratic decision-making that actually served residents' interests rather than one man's ego. My ranch had not only survived Kevin's assault, but had thrived beyond anything I'd imagined possible. The publicity from his trial had brought national attention to our operation, resulting in contracts with premium restaurants and organic food distributors who valued our story of perseverance against corruption. The same cattle Kevin had tried to silence with noise violations were now featured in magazine articles about sustainable agriculture and small business resilience. County Road 47 had been officially upgraded and paved, making it easier for customers to visit our farm store and educational tours. The financial recovery for HOA residents had been swift and comprehensive. Federal marshals had seized all of Kevin's assets, including his house, cars, and personal property, generating enough funds to fully reimburse every fraudulent fine he'd collected. The emergency reserve fund he'd looted was restored with interest, allowing the community to finally complete long-delayed infrastructure projects. Property values, which had actually declined under Kevin's reign of terror, rebounded strongly as word spread that the neighborhood was no longer controlled by a tyrannical madman. Marcus Webb had completed his probation and moved to another state, reportedly working as a bookkeeper under strict supervision. Tom Bradley had found employment with a landscaping company, apparently enjoying the irony of maintaining other people's lawns after years of measuring them for violations. Jake Patterson had become something of a neighborhood pariah, his informant activities having destroyed relationships with former friends who discovered his role in Kevin's surveillance network. The community center where Kevin had been arrested now hosted weekly farmers markets, featuring produce from my ranch alongside offerings from other local growers. The same room where he delivered his arrogant victory speech had been renamed the Transparency Hall, with Kevin's mugshot displayed in a frame labeled Never Again. Children who'd grown up under his oppressive rule were now playing freely in yards where their parents had once measured grass height with rulers to avoid citations. Mrs. Henderson had used her settlement money to buy back her family home and establish a scholarship fund for students studying agriculture and sustainable farming. David Chin's father had returned to the neighborhood, purchasing a larger house with his lawsuit proceeds and becoming an advocate for HOA reform. Both families had become regular customers at my ranch store, turning Kevin's victims into my strongest supporters through the strange alchemy of shared experience and mutual respect. The legal precedent set by Kevin's case had attracted attention from law enforcement agencies nationwide, leading to investigations of HOA corruption in dozens of other communities. District Attorney Michael Chun had used the case to establish a specialized unit for prosecuting neighborhood association fraud, calling Kevin's prosecution a template for holding petty tyrants accountable. Detective Ray Sullivan had been promoted and now traveled the country training officers to recognize and investigate HOA-related crimes. County Road 47 had become an unofficial symbol of resistance to authoritarian overreach, with local news featuring anniversary stories about the fence that brought down a dictator. The road sign had been upgraded to include a small plaque reading "Public Access Protected by Law," serving as a permanent reminder that some rights cannot be fenced away by petty officials with inflated egos. Tour groups occasionally stopped to photograph the spot where Kevin's illegal barrier had stood, turning his moment of supposed triumph into a tourist attraction celebrating his defeat. On quiet evenings, I often walked down County Road 47 to the spot where Kevin's fence had briefly blocked my family's legacy. The road surface was smooth and well-maintained now, funded by money recovered from his criminal enterprise. Cattle grazed peacefully in fields that Kevin had tried to silence, their contentment a testament to the power of perseverance over persecution. The sunset views that Kevin had tried to steal were more beautiful than ever, enhanced by the knowledge that they would never again be threatened by his brand of petty tyranny. The ultimate poetic justice was that Kevin's attempt to destroy my ranch had instead made it famous, while his effort to increase property values through authoritarian control had actually damaged them until his removal restored community peace. His fence had lasted 6 days, but the freedom and prosperity it had tried to block would last for generations. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well while your enemies destroy themselves through their own arrogance and criminality. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates into a thriving, democratic community became a case study taught in public administration courses and HOA management seminars across the country. Dr. Angela Foster, a community development specialist from the state university, had been appointed as interim administrator during the court-supervised restructuring, and her approach emphasized collaboration over control. The first order of business had been establishing new bylaws that required transparency, limited individual authority, and created multiple checks against the kind of abuse Kevin had perpetrated for years. The new HOA board was elected through a process designed to prevent another Kevin Morrison from seizing power. Board positions were limited to 2-year terms with mandatory rotation. Financial decisions required majority approval with independent oversight, and all meetings were required to be public with advance notice and recorded minutes. Robert Kim, a retired teacher who'd been one of Kevin's most vocal critics, was elected as the first post-Kevin president, running on a platform of service, not rulership, that resonated with residents tired of authoritarian management. Financial recovery had exceeded all expectations thanks to the thorough asset seizure and civil judgment collection process. The $2.8 million civil judgment against Kevin had been satisfied through the sale of his house, cars, boat, and other luxury items he'd purchased with stolen HOA funds. Additionally, the fines and fees he'd illegally collected were returned with interest, creating an unexpected windfall that allowed the community to invest in genuine improvements rather than Kevin's ego projects. The enhanced infrastructure projects funded by recovered money included the complete renovation of the community center, installation of a proper playground in the common area that Kevin had kept empty to avoid noise issues, and the creation of community gardens where families could grow vegetables together. The same spaces Kevin had patrolled for violations were now filled with children's laughter and neighborly cooperation. Mrs. Henderson had volunteered to manage the gardens, using her settlement money to purchase professional-grade tools and educational materials. Property values in Willowbrook Estates had increased by an average of 18% in the 2 years following Kevin's imprisonment, according to county assessor records. Real estate agents were actively marketing the community's transformation story, emphasizing the democratic governance and community spirit that had replaced Kevin's oppressive regime. The neighborhood had become a model for how HOAs should operate, attracting young families who valued both property maintenance standards and personal freedom. My ranch had become an integral part of the community's identity rather than the source of conflict Kevin had tried to create. The weekly farmers market in the community center featured my produce alongside offerings from other local growers, creating economic opportunities that benefited everyone. Educational tours of the ranch had become popular with local schools, teaching children about sustainable agriculture and the importance of standing up to bullies whether they wear badges or polo shirts. The legal reforms triggered by Kevin's case had spread far beyond our community. State legislation now required HOA boards to undergo training in property law and fiduciary responsibility, financial audits for any community association managing more than $100,000 in annual dues, and criminal background checks for anyone seeking board positions. Kevin's spectacular crimes had created awareness that prevented similar abuse in hundreds of other neighborhoods across the state. Tom Bradley's transformation had been particularly remarkable. After completing his sentence for his role in Kevin's enforcement conspiracy, he'd approached me about employment at the ranch, seeking to make amends for his participation in the harassment campaign. His experience with landscaping and property maintenance, previously used for Kevin's petty persecution, had proven valuable for legitimate ranch operations. His genuine remorse and hard work had gradually earned forgiveness from neighbors he'd once terrorized with measuring tapes and citation cameras. The community center's transparency hall had evolved from a simple reminder of Kevin's crimes into a celebration of democratic governance and civic engagement. The display now included copies of the new bylaws, photos from community events, and testimonials from residents about the positive changes since Kevin's removal. School groups often visited to learn about local government and the importance of holding leaders accountable for their actions. Jake Patterson had struggled more with redemption than the others, his informant activities having created lasting trust issues with former friends and neighbors. However, he'd eventually found purpose in establishing a neighborhood watch program focused on actual safety concerns rather than Kevin's style of harassment surveillance. His intimate knowledge of Kevin's methods had proven valuable in training other communities to recognize and prevent HOA abuse before it reached criminal levels. The annual Liberation Day celebration held each year on the anniversary of Kevin's arrest had become the community's most popular event, featuring barbecue from my ranch, live music in the community center, and speeches about the importance of civic engagement. Children who'd grown up under Kevin's oppressive rule were now teenagers who understood that authority figures must be held accountable and that communities thrive through cooperation rather than domination. Federal Correctional Institution Ashland had been Kevin Morrison's home for 3 years when he first attempted to contact me through the prison mail system. His letter, written on regulation prison stationery in careful block letters, was a masterpiece of self-serving manipulation disguised as remorse. He claimed to have found religion, discovered the error of his ways, and developed deep regret for his overzealous community leadership that had unfortunately resulted in misunderstandings. The letter carefully avoided any admission of actual criminal behavior while positioning himself as a victim of prosecutorial overreach and community ingratitude. Prison had not been kind to Kevin's delusions of grandeur. The man who'd terrorized neighbors over grass height violations was now subject to cell inspections, guard supervision, and a rigid schedule that left no room for the control he'd once exercised. His cellmate, according to prison sources, was a former city councilman named Jerry Martinez who'd been convicted of embezzling municipal funds and had little patience for Kevin's continued complaints about the injustice of his situation. Jerry reportedly told other inmates that Kevin spent most NGHDS muttering about ungrateful neighbors and vindictive prosecutors. Kevin's attempts at prison leadership had been spectacularly unsuccessful. His first week had included an effort to organize fellow inmates around proper cell maintenance standards and common area usage protocols that had resulted in him being stuffed headfirst into a laundry cart by a bank robber named Luis who'd grown tired of Kevin's measuring tape mentality. The prison grapevine, according to Detective Sullivan, who maintained contact with corrections officials, indicated that Kevin was generally regarded as an annoying pest whose authority complex made him unsuitable for any position of responsibility. The second letter had arrived 6 months later, this time claiming Kevin had been misunderstood and that his HOA leadership had been distorted by legal technicalities rather than acknowledged as the community service he'd intended. He'd apparently convinced himself that blocking County Road 47 had been a legitimate property management decision rather than criminal obstruction, and that his financial management had been creative accounting rather than systematic theft. The letter included a rambling explanation of how his actions had actually increased property values and improved community standards. Kevin's wife, Sarah, had divorced him within the first year of his imprisonment, taking their son, Michael, and moving across the country to escape the stigma of his crimes. She'd sold the house to pay legal fees and restitution requirements, leaving Kevin with no family support and no assets to fund his continued appeals. His son, who'd been a senior in high school when Kevin was arrested, had changed his last name and refused all contact with his father. The family Kevin had claimed to be protecting through his HOA tyranny had been destroyed by his criminal behavior. Prison medical records obtained through Detective Sullivan's continued investigation revealed that Kevin had been treated multiple times for stress-related ailments including ulcers, anxiety attacks, and insomnia. The man who'd thrived on controlling others was struggling to adapt to being controlled by a system that didn't recognize his self-proclaimed authority. His medical complaints often referenced unjust treatment and failure to recognize his leadership experience, suggesting he still hadn't accepted responsibility for his criminal behavior. Kevin's third letter had been the most delusional yet, proposing a partnership opportunity where I would hire him as a community relations consultant upon his release to help other neighborhoods avoid the misunderstandings that had occurred in Willowbrook Estates. He'd apparently convinced himself that his experience as a convicted felon would somehow qualify him to advise other HOA boards, completely ignoring the fact that he was legally prohibited from serving in any fiduciary capacity and that no community would trust someone with his criminal record. The prison education programs Kevin had enrolled in told the story of a man desperately trying to rebuild his shattered identity. He'd completed courses in business ethics, community leadership, and conflict resolution, earning certificates he seemed to believe would somehow erase his criminal convictions. His instructors reported that Kevin consistently positioned himself as a victim of circumstances rather than accepting responsibility for his choices, making him unsuitable for any role requiring moral authority or community trust. Fellow inmates had given Kevin the nickname Mayor Pete, in mocking reference to his continued belief that he was leadership material despite his current circumstances. Prison social workers noted in their reports that Kevin frequently complained about the quality of people he was forced to associate with, apparently unable to recognize that he belonged exactly where he was. His adjustment scores remained poor throughout his incarceration, with guards noting his continued attempts to organize other inmates and his complaints about institutional inefficiency. The most pathetic aspect of Kevin's prison experience was his continued obsession with HOA management and community control. He'd accumulated a collection of HOA newsletters and property management magazines, studying them like a deposed dictator planning his return to power. Prison librarians reported that he spent hours researching property law and community association regulations, apparently convinced that knowledge would somehow vindicate his previous criminal behavior rather than simply highlighting how thoroughly he'd violated established legal standards. Kevin's parole applications, submitted annually despite his minimum 8-year sentence, consistently revealed his fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his crimes. Each application claimed he'd been overcharged for administrative disagreements and positioned his victims as disgruntled residents who'd misunderstood his leadership style. The parole board's rejection letters grew increasingly sharp in their assessment of Kevin's continued denial and unsuitability for release into any community setting where he might regain authority over others. 8 years had passed since Kevin Morrison's sentencing when I received the final letter from Federal Correctional Institution Ashland. This time it wasn't from Kevin. It was from the prison chaplain, Father Michael Rodriguez, informing me that Kevin had suffered a massive heart attack during his morning workout routine and died instantly at age 53. The chaplain's note mentioned that Kevin had left instructions requesting that I be notified of his death, along with a final letter he'd written but never sent, sealed and marked to be delivered upon my passing. Kevin's final letter was a rambling, bitter document that revealed a man who'd learned nothing from 8 years of incarceration and had died still believing himself to be the victim of a vast conspiracy. He blamed me for destroying his life through vindictive prosecution of minor administrative disagreements, accused the federal justice system of persecuting community leaders, and maintained that his actions had been mischaracterized by hostile neighbors and overzealous prosecutors. Even facing death, Kevin Morrison could not accept responsibility for the crimes that had destroyed his family, impoverished his community, and ultimately led to his lonely death in federal prison. The news of Kevin's death barely registered in Willowbrook Estates, where his name had become synonymous with cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked authority. The community had moved so far beyond his toxic legacy that many newer residents didn't even know the story of the dictatorial HOA president who'd once terrorized their neighborhood. His death was mentioned in a brief newspaper obituary that focused more on his criminal convictions than any positive accomplishments, a fitting final judgment on a life wasted through greed, arrogance, and the abuse of power. My ranch had evolved into a regional destination that employed 12 full-time workers and hosted thousands of visitors annually for educational tours, farmers markets, and agricultural workshops. The county road that Kevin had tried to block with his illegal fence was now a scenic byway featured in tourism brochures, bringing economic benefits to the entire region. The cattle Kevin had tried to silence were now featured in documentaries about sustainable agriculture, their peaceful presence serving as a testament to the power of perseverance over persecution. The legal precedent established by Kevin's prosecution had grown into a nationwide movement for HOA accountability and transparency. Law schools now taught courses on community association law that used Kevin's case as a primary example of criminal abuse of fiduciary duty. The Morrison Standard had become legal shorthand for the level of evidence required to prosecute HOA corruption, and dozens of similar cases across the country had resulted in convictions using the investigative methods developed during Kevin's prosecution. Willowbrook Estates had become a model community studied by urban planners and community development specialists from across the nation. The democratic governance structure implemented after Kevin's removal had prevented any recurrence of authoritarian abuse, while maintaining property values and community standards through cooperation rather than coercion. Property values had continued to increase steadily, vindicating the principle that communities thrive through mutual respect rather than fear-based compliance. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, had become the community's unofficial historian, maintaining detailed records of both Kevin's crimes and the neighborhood's subsequent recovery. Her scholarship fund had sent 17 students to college to study agriculture, community development, and public administration, creating a new generation of leaders committed to service rather than self-aggrandizement. The community garden she managed had expanded to include a memorial section dedicated to overcoming tyranny through unity. The annual Liberation Day celebration had evolved into a regional festival that attracted visitors from surrounding counties who came to hear the story of how one community had successfully removed a corrupt leader and rebuilt itself through democratic principles. Local politicians often spoke at the event, using Kevin's story to illustrate the importance of civic engagement and the dangers of apathy in the face of creeping authoritarianism. The festival had become a symbol of hope for other communities struggling with similar abuses of power. Detective Ray Sullivan had retired from law enforcement and established a consulting firm specializing in HOA fraud investigation, using the techniques developed during Kevin's case to help other communities identify and prosecute corrupt board members. His work had resulted in over 40 successful prosecutions nationwide, with recovered funds totaling more than $12 million returned to victimized homeowners. Ray often spoke at the Liberation Day Festival, emphasizing that justice requires both courage and persistence. County Road 47 had been designated as a historic thoroughfare by the State Transportation Department, with historical markers explaining how the road's blockage had led to one of the most significant HOA corruption prosecutions in American legal history. School groups regularly visited the markers as part of civics education programs, learning about the importance of standing up to authority figures who abuse their power and the legal system's role in protecting individual rights against institutional tyranny. The fence posts where Kevin's illegal barrier had briefly stood were now marked with a small monument reading, "In memory of rights restored," that serve as a permanent reminder of the victory of justice over corruption. Children playing in the area often asked their parents about the monument, creating opportunities to teach new generations about the importance of civic engagement and the responsibility to resist authoritarian overreach, whether it comes from government officials or neighborhood associations. As I walked County Road 47 on the 10th anniversary of Kevin's arrest, I reflected on how his attempt to destroy my family's legacy had instead created a lasting symbol of resistance to petty tyranny. The road was busier now, with customers visiting my ranch store, families heading to community events, and tourists following the historic byway that had become a destination in its own right. Kevin's fence had lasted 6 days, but the freedom it had tried to block would endure for generations. The final victory wasn't Kevin's death in prison. It was the thriving community, successful ranch, and lasting legal precedent that had grown from the ashes of his criminal empire. His attempt to be remembered as a powerful leader had instead made him a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. Sometimes the best revenge is simply building something beautiful where your enemies tried to create ugliness, and letting time prove which vision was worthy of remembrance. Have you ever had to stand up to a neighborhood bully or corrupt authority figure? Share your story in the comments below, and remember that justice sometimes takes time, but it's always worth fighting for. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refused to be victims and fought back against those who thought they were untouchable. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of neighborly conflict, the abuse of authority, and the strategic triumph over injustice. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and the dramatic consequences of underestimating a determined individual.